Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Churchill Conversations. Today, we're going to be discussing Churchill's D-Day, which also happens to be the title for the latest book by our panel of guests today. My name is John Olson. I'm with the International Churchill Society. And if you'd like to find out how to join the society, please visit winstonchurchill.org for more information. We also have our international conference coming up and in October in Washington this year, and there's more information about that on our website as well. So we have over 1,200 people registered for today, and it's truly an international audience. There's indeed Churchillians in every corner of the globe. Today we welcome viewers from the East, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, from the Americas, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, and hundreds of members and friends in the US. We have viewers all over Europe, Albania, Switzerland, Germany, Belgium, Denmark, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Moldova, Serbia, Sweden, Ireland, and lots of friends from Ukraine. We also have friends in Israel and Kenya, and dozens of Churchillians joining us from the United Kingdom. So today we have the pleasure of having Catherine Grace Katz join us to moderate the discussion. And she is a devoted Churchillian. She's been involved with the Churchill Society for quite some time. And she's on the board of the society as well. And I don't know how she fits all of this in, with just having finished her law degree at Harvard. And she wrote a book last year, published a book called The Daughters of Yalta, which I can highly recommend. It's about daughters of three of the key players at the Yalta Conference during the Second World War. The daughter of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Averell Harriman, and the backstory and the behind the scenes goings on in their support of the conference and their famous fathers. So, Catherine, also one more thing. Let me just actually mention that Catherine has a new book coming out September, October of next year on the Hindenburg disaster, and Catherine might have some more information to give on that later. Or actually, what I may do is we'll send an email from the society after the webinar is concluded, and we'll put some more information about Catherine's upcoming book and maybe a few other little things that are mentioned during the call today. So with that, Catherine, I'm going to hand over to you and let you take it away.
Thank you, John. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you from around the world today, and especially our brilliant panelists and authors of this fantastic book, Churchill's D-Day, The British Bulldog's Fateful Hours During the Normandy Invasion. It is, of course, a very appropriate time of year to be discussing this subject, with the D-Day anniversary having just been last week on June 6th. And of course, this year, 2025, being the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. It's always a good time to think about the lessons of World War II, the greatest generation, and the leaders who shaped that time, but certainly no time like the present. I am so pleased to introduce you today to both of our panelists. First, General Lord Dannatt, who served as a soldier for 40 years to the day, concluding his career as Chief of the General Staff, the professional head of the British Army, during which time he led the British Army through 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2011, he became an independent member of the House of Lords. He's a frequent commentator on defense and security issues in the media and serves as a deputy lieutenant for both Greater London and Norfolk. He's the author of several books, including most recently co-author with historian Robert Lyman of Korea, War Without End. Lord Dannatt also serves as chairman of trustees of the British Normandy Memorial. Alan Packwood has served as the director of the Churchill Archive Center since 2002. A fellow of the Royal Historical Society, he oversees the world's most significant collections of modern political, diplomatic, and scientific papers, including those of Sir Winston Churchill and Baroness Thatcher. One of the foremost experts in his field, he has curated international exhibitions, including at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and organized international conferences around the world, sharing Churchill's life story and legacy. Alan is the author of How Churchill Waged War, editor of the Cambridge University Press Companion to Winston Churchill, and co-editor of Letters for the Ages, the private and personal letters of Sir Winston Churchill. He was awarded an OBE for services to archives and scholarships in the 2016 Queen's Birthday Honors. On a personal note, I've had the pleasure of knowing Alan for over a decade at this point. He was instrumental, he and his team, absolutely invaluable in their help as I was researching Daughters of Yalta, and even before that, when I was a graduate student at Christ College, Cambridge. So it's a real pleasure to be with Alan and Richard today. And if any of you have the opportunity to visit the Churchill Archive Center in Cambridge, I highly recommend it, and stop for a Chelsea bun at Fitzbilly's along the way. So without further ado, we will get started. And first, I just would love to have both of our panelists set the scene for D-Day itself. I think many people in the audience are generally familiar with D-Day. Many of us saw incredibly moving tributes to the veterans who made it all the way back to Normandy last year for the 80th anniversary, truly remarkable. But for our people who are joining us today who are perhaps a little bit less familiar, let's set the scene. It's the spring of 1944. Stalin has been pressuring his allies to open the Western Front to take the pressure off the Red Army holding the line in the East. But up until this point, his allies, Churchill and Roosevelt, but especially Churchill, have resisted opening the Second Front. Why is that, and why are things changing?
Okay,
Alan,
Richard, do you want to come in, or shall I make a start with this?
Well, Catherine, thank you for that great introduction. Just this last weekend on the 6th of June, I was in Normandy, and it was a real privilege to be there with the small handful of genuine veterans going back to that campaign, and to stand on the high ground of what is actually now the British Memorial, looking out to sea, looking to my right towards Gold Beach, where the British 50th Division stormed ashore, and then looking to my left, the Mulberry Harbour above Arromanches, where the logistic lifeblood of the campaign flowed through. It just brought it home to one. Of course, this was the largest amphibious, the largest international tri-service, multi-service operation that the world has ever seen. Over 150,000 troops coming ashore on that day on 5 beaches. 2 American divisions, 2 British divisions, a Canadian division, supported by a tremendous array of battleships, destroyers, frigates, shooting the troops in, and numerous sorties, the sky darkening with aircraft. During the night prior to the landings, dropping 3 divisions of paratroopers to secure the flanks of the invasion. And, well, as we'll probably say a little bit later, Winston Churchill, who we're obviously focusing on a fair amount tonight, he worried the night before that operation, and he wrote a note to his lovely wife Clementine and said, "Do you realize that by tomorrow morning 20,000 young men could be dead?" Now, mercifully, his worst fears were not realized, but there was fierce fighting on Omaha Beach in particular, fierce fighting during the whole of the Normandy campaign. But eventually, the D-Day landings, the Normandy campaign, opened the way to the liberation of Paris and opened the way to the restoration of peace in Europe, which, Catherine, as you said, we commemorated on the 8th of May this year, the Victory in Europe 80th anniversary. So it was an incredible day, and Alan and I have been privileged to write a book about it, and Churchill's not inconsiderable misgivings about it, but his not inconsiderable support to it when push came to shove. But what do you think, Alan?
Absolutely. And I mean, Richard has just extremely eloquently described the enormous scale of this operation. And clearly this was something that could not be undertaken lightly or quickly. And I think in the book, what Richard and I try and do is to explain the development of the strategy and the planning that went into this operation, which really started as early as 1942, just after Pearl Harbor, just after the United States had come into the conflict. And one of the things that we focus on are the number of preconditions that had to be met before you could contemplate an operation of this scale. An assault against a heavily defended enemy shoreline. So, of course, you've got to have control of the seas. So before you can contemplate landing in Normandy, you've got to make sure that you've got control of the Atlantic, so that you can bring the forces and the supplies across the Atlantic and assemble them in the UK. Equally, you have to have mastery of the skies over Europe, and that takes time to achieve. It takes time to win the Battle of the Atlantic. It takes time to wear the Luftwaffe down. You have a build-up of operations, air operations, an increasing tempo from the time of the Casablanca Conference onwards to bomb Germany, to reduce the German capacity and strength, while simultaneously building up the troop numbers and the infrastructure in the UK to support and sustain an operation of this scale. An operation which is not just about the initial assault, but which is also about thereafter pushing on through France into Germany and winning the war in Europe. It's not just about the military planning, it's also about the equivalent planning of the deception operations, to do as much as you can to protect the troops. At the Tehran conference, of course, Churchill famously says to Stalin, "The truth is so precious that she should always be protected by a bodyguard of lies." And alongside the actual military planning for this operation, you've got incredibly complex deception plans being built up. The creation of a whole fictional army group commanded by General Patton in the Thames area, with the idea that this might come across and threaten the Pas-de-Calais area. So you've got to reduce the enemy forces while building up the Allied forces. And all of that takes time. And I think that Churchill and Eisenhower and the other commanders deserve an enormous amount of credit for actually holding back and not going until victory was certain, until they were sure that they had the right equipment in place, the right tactics, and the right troops to deliver victory.
And of course, what we always say, Alan, is that we, in writing this book, have the luxury of hindsight. We
Yeah.
know that the operation was successful. But go back to what I was saying the evening before, writing to Clementine, do you realize that by tomorrow morning, 20,000 young men could be dead? Churchill was scarred by Dardanelles when he was First Lord of the Admiralty, scarred to a certain extent also by the Norway campaign of early 1940, again when he was First Lord of the Admiralty. So he was genuinely fearful that this great enterprise, which we now know with hindsight was successful, but they didn't know so at the time. Sorry, Catherine, we've gone on a long time.
It's all important to set the scene. There's so many different components that went into making sure that D-Day was going to be a success and that the worst that Churchill feared never came to pass. Of course, that's not without some consternation amongst the Allied partners. Stalin has been pushing for the Western Front to be opened sooner than it was, although with so many preconditions that needed to be met, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we can see that it really wasn't possible to have done so successfully any earlier than June of 1944. Thinking about the objectives for D-Day, of course, there's D-Day itself and the immediate aftermath, but then there is the days and weeks and months that follow. What are the objectives of the D-Day invasion specifically, and then what are the longer, medium-term objectives that follow?
Well, that's a very good question. Of course, you're absolutely right. A lodgement back into Europe was the initial objective. But I think it's worth, and I don't want to deviate from the question that you've just asked, but it's worth just bearing in mind that, of course, Churchill is remembered particularly for his leadership of Britain in 1940. He became Prime Minister at a time of great trial for the United Kingdom. And this is where his famous speeches are so well known. We will never surrender. We'll fight them on the beaches, the landing places, all that pure, wonderful, gold Churchillian stuff. But of course, the thing was that at that stage, Britain was alone. He was the leader, and he could call the shots. And what you're alluding to is very important, because the next year in 1941 were those two seminal events when Hitler made what was ultimately a strategic, disastrous decision to launch Operation Barbarossa and attack the Soviet Union. And it brought the might of the Soviet Union into the war against Germany. And then, of course, the Japanese, for their own purposes, brought America into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And from Winston Churchill's point of view, instead of standing alone, fighting alone, he had the Soviet Union in support, and he had got what he really wanted, which is the United States, President Roosevelt and the United States in support. So in a sense for him, and he often said, he could sleep more easily having got those two great allies. And of course, what the book tries to discuss is how he managed those two supreme leaders, Stalin always pressing to get Allied troops into the fight. Why is it my soldiers who are dying fighting Germans? But then equally, the Americans had to build up almost from scratch their military, their army, their navy, their air force, get the air force deployed to the United Kingdom, start the daylight bombing of Germany, and build up, bring 1.5 million Americans into Britain. So all this really had to be done before, and I'm coming back to your question now, before the assault, postponed from the 5th of June to the 6th of June, those 5 beaches, those 5 divisions that landed, important to get a lodgement, but then to fight the battle according to Field Marshal Montgomery's plan, which he sort of slightly improved the telling of afterwards, to hold the strength of the Germans against the British around Caen, to allow the Americans under Bradley and then later on Patton to break out on the right, to conduct a great hook and eventually get maneuver back into the campaign, to cross the Seine, to liberate Paris, and then the great rush across Europe, which eventually led, after the difficulties in the Ardennes over Christmas 1944-45, to the Rhine crossing, and eventually to the verge of Berlin. And of course, this is a slightly interesting question. Did the Allies somewhat hold back to allow the Soviets to expend their lives and their blood and their treasure going into Berlin? But anyway, the upshot was that Nazi Germany was defeated. Hitler took his own life. And as we said earlier, we commemorated and celebrated Victory in Europe Day on the 8th of May, 1945, and 2025 this year. Sorry, that's probably a rather longer answer than you were bargaining for. Apologies.
I mean, I think what you've emphasized there, Richard, is that this was Overlord, and what follows on from Overlord is the culmination of that international alliance, which Churchill plays such a key role in building and then maintaining. And you've set me up, of course, as always, very nicely with a couple of quotes from the archive about that. And some of the audience will know these already. But of course, of his alliance with the Soviet Union, which was not a particularly natural alliance for an anti-Bolshevik like Churchill, he famously said, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." And of course, of the alliance with the United States, he famously said, "No lover studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt." But I think the point that I would like to make here, and which we do bring out in the book, I think, is that Churchill is not having to think just about the military operation in the way that Eisenhower and Montgomery and Ramsay are. He is also having to think about the political implications of this campaign. And that means, of course, that in the immediate run-up to D-Day, he's concerned about the plans to bomb the French railway marshalling yards, because he fears actually that runs a risk of turning the French population against the Allies. And in the short term, that might create a dull hatred which prevents them from rising up and supporting the liberating forces. In the longer term, he's thinking about the post-war settlement. He's concerned that actually might drive a wedge between France and the United States and the United Kingdom, and actually might encourage communism in France. Similarly, he doesn't want to abandon Italy completely, because he is thinking about Britain's post-war position in the Mediterranean and the Balkans. Roosevelt's concern post-war is the development of the United Nations and encouraging the Soviets to come in against the Japanese. He's thinking increasingly about the war in the Pacific theatre. For Churchill, the priority is a return to the British Empire of 1939, and therefore he's concerned about the Russian domination of the Balkans and ensuring that Britain's position in the Mediterranean is preserved. So you start to see all of these political considerations coming in and influencing events from the 6th of June onwards as well.
Alan, you referenced kind of all these different stakeholders and different competing interests that are involved in D-Day and everything that they hope will follow, from the political to the military. Can you take us through a little bit more of the mechanics of Churchill's role in planning D-Day as he was working with the military side, as he was working with FDR and Stalin? How is he balancing all of these interests in practice?
Well, I'll let Richard perhaps talk in a minute a bit more about the military side of the things, but certainly on the political side, Churchill is certainly playing a key role at a sort of grand strategic level in terms of the relationship with President Roosevelt and Marshal Stalin. And that, of course, leads to a succession of key conferences at which the strategy which culminates in Overlord is hammered out during 1942 and 1943, culminating in the 1943 Tehran Conference. And of course, the amount of travel that Churchill is doing to hold this alliance together is staggering. I think Stalin said that if the big three were like the Holy Trinity, then Churchill was the Holy Ghost, because he was the one that was doing all the flitting about. He was traveling to the United States to see Roosevelt. He was traveling to Moscow to see Stalin. And of course, this did take an enormous toll on his health. After the Tehran Conference in November 1943, he's struck down with pneumonia in Carthage and comes actually very close to death. And I'm not sure his health ever fully recovers during the rest of the war. So he's playing this very sort of key role at the sort of grand strategic level. I think he's frustrated slightly at the military level that he can't play a more active role in the development of the military plans for D-Day itself. But of course, those are firmly in the hands of Eisenhower and Montgomery and their teams. But the other place where he does play a key role, which is an area which I think is often overlooked, is in putting in place the domestic preparations and the civilian preparations that guarantee the success of this operation, because he's basically having to preside over turning the United Kingdom into a heavily armed camp. And Richard referenced a minute ago 1.6 million US servicemen coming over. You've got the Canadian 3rd Division. You've got forces from all over the rest of the world being assembled in the United Kingdom. You've got to put in place the infrastructure to support and sustain them. And you've got to take some really difficult decisions, political decisions, about when to lock down the UK, when to stop communication with other countries. Get those decisions wrong, and you actually risk compromising the military operations and sending a signal to your enemy that the assault is about to be launched. And Churchill personally chaired the Overlord Preparations Committee, which was a key committee meeting on a regular basis prior to D-Day to actually make sure that all of the key production targets were being met, to make sure that the security was being maintained. And he's taking a very clear and very high level of interest in all of those preparations, using the convening power of his office.
And I think it's probably worth saying, just coming back, that when he became Prime Minister, he reorganized the top end of the British government. Yes, he became Prime Minister, but he created the appointment of Minister of Defence, which he placed himself in. So that meant that he had not just wide-ranging political control across the country, he had specific mandated control over the armed forces. The chiefs of staff reported to him. So he created the levers of government that he made sure that he pulled in the way that he wanted to. We talked earlier or Alan talked earlier about mastery of the seas. Well, one of the great threats to the American build-up was the U-boat threat, and that absolutely had to be countered before, well, before certainly American service people could be brought across, but actually to prevent the United Kingdom starving. And Churchill personally chaired the committee that ran the anti-U-boat campaign. And having successfully done that, as Alan just said, he then chaired the committee in that sort of time slot for all the preparations. So he was absolutely instrumental in some of the detail. Now he had to separate what he could do to do his best to make sure the preconditions were met, to make sure the country was pulling its weight, the industry was producing the Mulberry Harbours and the pipeline under the ocean. All these whips had to be cracked to make sure, but he had to discipline himself to allow the military planning to be done by Eisenhower as the Supreme Commander, Montgomery as the Land Forces Commander, Ramsey as the Naval Commander. Um, when it came to the final major briefing at St Paul's Church, St Paul's School, a month or so before, he could barely contain his own enthusiasm in asking questions about the planning, and then from there he moved his own personal headquarters into a railway carriage in Hampshire, in a place called Droxford, which was symptomatic of him wanting to be as near the action as possible. Now, of course, it was a nightmare for his staff because this was quite a small railway carriage. It was actually only connected to the outside world by one telephone line into the local exchange. But it meant that he could actually get close to Eisenhower's headquarters, close to Montgomery's headquarters. And on his last visit to Montgomery's headquarters, Montgomery was giving him a final briefing, and Churchill started to criticize the number of vehicles that were going to be taken across. Surely you don't need all these vehicles. Prime Minister, are you now questioning at this late stage my military plan? Because this is not your job. Please just contain yourself. Well, he was then due to have dinner with Montgomery's staff after that closed session. And he went through to where all the officers were and he said, "Good evening, gentlemen. I'm told I can't talk to you." He was being constrained by what he could and what he couldn't say. But this has got to come out somewhere in this discussion. Of course, if I'm now talking about how he wanted to be close to the action, he came up with this wonderful plan and he ordered Admiral Ramsey, the overall naval commander, to prepare a plan that he, Winston Churchill, and the King, King George VI, would embark on HMS Belfast and that they would be present on the ship as the Belfast joined the barrage on the morning of the 6th of June. And Churchill thought this was just wonderful. And then furthermore, the plan was that he would then transship to a destroyer and go ashore that day just to see how things were going on. Well, Tommy Lascelles, who was the King's private secretary, just thought this was an absolute disaster, an absolute nightmare, tried to dissuade Churchill, and eventually persuaded the King to write not once but twice to Winston Churchill to say, "You are not going and I'm not coming with you." And very reluctantly and rather grumpily, Churchill accepted his sovereign's diktat that he was going to stay at home. And he didn't, in fact, in the end, get to Normandy until the 11th of June. And of course, the picture on the front of the book is the day that he arrived to have a look at what was going on. Interestingly enough, and I am diverting here a little bit, he took his great friend Field Marshal Smuts, Jan Smuts, with him, the South African president, and they got on really well. And when they later in that day, having gone to Normandy, they had lunch and a briefing with Montgomery in his caravan, Smuts sniffed the air and said, "I think there are Germans around here." Well, no one thought much about it. But whether it's true or whether it's apocryphal, a few days later, 2 German paratroopers emerged out of the bushes. Just think, had they been brave enough to kill Churchill, Smuts, Montgomery, well, their names would have gone down in infamy and in history. Maybe it's true, maybe it's apocryphal, but Smuts, I can smell Germans around here.
Well, Richard, you've read my mind, because one of the things I was going to ask you, both of you, was about some of the remarkable treasures that we have in the archives that allow us to reconstruct all of these incredible conversations, relationships, the strategic planning behind D-Day, and especially the series of exchanges with the king, which I was lucky enough to see, and Alan was kind enough to show me on one of my visits to the archives. An absolutely remarkable gem. And I think that those are some of the documents and the moments that really allow us to see these individuals as people, as human beings, without kind of being on a pedestal such that you can't relate to them. And seeing this exchange between Churchill and the king, with the king giving him a bit of a smack down, is just fantastic. I was wondering if you could tell us about maybe another one or two of these remarkable treasures that survive in the archives today that really gives us insights into the story of D-Day and Churchill's leadership, especially since these documents form the basis of your remarkable book.
Okay. Well, let me go first, and I'm sure I'll miss some, Richard. But I mean, obviously, one of the things that we wanted to do with this book, as we said at the beginning, was to sort of strip away the layers of hindsight, and give people an insight into the contents of Churchill's dispatch box, look at some of the messages that he was receiving, and look at how he was responding to those. And obviously, that's the great advantage of sitting on top of a wonderful archive like this. Many of your listeners will have visited the Churchill archive or will have used the Churchill archive. They will know it. I mean, it is an incredible resource. You're talking about 2,500 boxes, about 1 million items that he kept. And you know, here was a man who, as his daughter Mary says, lived from pen to mouth. So we have this sort of fantastic archive, and we certainly wanted to use it. So a couple of other documents that you will see reproduced in the book. One of the key ones that we reproduce is the letter that arrives on Churchill's desk in April 1942, handwritten letter from President Roosevelt, basically saying that he's sending over Harry Hopkins and George Marshall to open discussions about a second front, and that Roosevelt, in his own words, is very conscious that today the Russians are killing more Germans and destroying more equipment than you and I put together. And what I love about this letter is it gives you a sort of real insight into how Roosevelt worked, and this wonderful sort of combination of grand strategy with the very personal, because the letter ends that Churchill should tell Harry Hopkins to obey Dr. Fulton, US Navy, whom I'm sending as super nurse with full authority. Of course, Hopkins's health was notoriously bad. What Roosevelt is really saying to Churchill there is, don't keep Hopkins up drinking. But this is sort of very informal in tone letter, which is actually a letter that opens the discussions that ultimately lead to Operation Overlord, and comes with the very first version of the plan for operations that has been developed by Marshall and Eisenhower, which is calling for immediate operations over France, and is talking about the possibility of a large-scale operation by April 1943, all of which, of course, is completely impossible as far as Churchill is concerned, given how stretched the British are at that point. So you've got that sort of wonderful letter. Another really powerful letter, I think, is the one that Clementine Churchill writes to her husband, this little note that she writes to him on the 5th of June 1944, where she basically says that she's thinking of him in this agonizing moment so full of suspense, and she tells him to write a letter to the poor king, probably aware of the correspondence that has taken place between the two of them over D-Day. And for me, letters like that plunge you back into the moment, and give you a real insight into the character and the emotion.
And I think, just staying on the same theme, I'm very taken by Churchill, the Tehran conference, commenting on his relationship between his two enormous partners in this great enterprise, Stalin and Roosevelt. And he says, there am I sitting between the Russian bear and the American buffalo, and I'm the little English donkey, but I'm the only one who knows the way home. And this again is him just saying that actually I'm thinking beyond winning the war. I'm thinking about what the post-war situation is going to look like. Narrowly, he's looking about what Britain's position in the post-war world is going to be, but he was actually being the ultimate statesman, so thinking beyond the military campaign. Where was the world going to be? And I think that's a fundamental attribute and a fundamental characteristic of Churchill, which it just places him in pretty much a league of his own.
Absolutely. Well, before we turn to audience questions, I have two more questions for both of you. First of all, I think all of us are very curious to know, how did the two of you come together to write this book? Why did you feel it was important to do so now? And each of you are at the top of your field in fields that are complementary, but also slightly different. And how did the experience of working with a co-author coming at a subject in which you're both experts but from a different perspective, bring to light something that perhaps you may not have considered about Churchill or D-Day previously?
Well, the conception of the book started with, and listeners will probably be conversant with another wonderful military historian, Bill Barnett, who actually happened to be a close neighbour of mine here in England, who died, and his family, and of course, Bill Barnett was the original keeper of the Churchill archives. His family asked if I would give the eulogy at his memorial, which was held at Churchill College, Cambridge. And that event took place, and Alan very politely then walked me back to my car after the event and said, I've been thinking as we're approaching the 80th anniversary of D-Day that actually it would be quite a good thing to write a book about Churchill's contribution to D-Day. You know, we all know about Churchill in 1940, we know about his great speeches, but Churchill and D-Day. And Alan said, well, look, you know, I've got access to the archive material. I think you know a thing or two about the military side of it. So we agreed to work together. We also then realized actually we didn't have very long, and that June 2024 was actually only about 18 months away. So anyway, cut a long story short, we agreed to get on with it, and yes, and lo and behold, due to a good agent and willing publishers, the book appeared in May 2024 in time for the 6th of June, D-Day 80.
And just to amplify that and to answer the question why it was important, I think we probably both felt that Churchill sort of doesn't really appear in the D-Day picture. When people talk about D-Day, the focus tends to be on largely American troops storming ashore, as in the movie Saving Private Ryan. And when Churchill has been portrayed in relation to D-Day, it's sometimes been negatively. So General Eisenhower, in his book Crusade in Europe, published just after the war, he made the comment that Churchill feared on the eve that the waves would run red with blood. And of course, that was used as the starting point for the movie Churchill, which came out in 2017, I think, with Brian Cox playing Winston, where that movie literally opens with Churchill pacing along a British beach, looking out across the channel, and in his mind's eye, seeing the waves run red with blood. And it shows him sort of terrified of a recurrence of Gallipoli. And in the movie, of course, he then does everything he can to obstruct the operation and takes to his bed when no one will listen to him. And that clearly wasn't the case. So I think what we wanted to do was to go back and then through the documents revisit the strategy and the planning for D-Day, and to show what his contribution was and how his thinking developed. It's not to say that he didn't have reservations at certain points. He did, but it was to put those in context and to explain those. As to how the experience worked, well, from my perspective, and don't quote me on this, I can say that working with a general is an awful lot easier than working with other academics.
Well, I think the other, and actually, well, probably from my point of view, it's probably easier working with an academic than with another general. But I think sometimes we're asked, were there any points of friction between you? Well, of course, there weren't, but we had one very interesting discussion early on, and that was what tense we would write the book in.
Yeah.
And there was a debate whether we would write it in the present tense to try and make it sound more urgent, or whether we would write it in the past tense. And And we tried a couple of chapters in the present tense and then came to the conclusion it just didn't work, and that the past tense, when written well, can be just as electrifying, just as engaging as the present tense. And for those who have read the book, or those who might read the book at some point in the future, they will see it's written in the past tense, partly reflecting the fact that we have the benefit of hindsight. But actually, I think the urgency of some of the descriptions of Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis coming down the scrambling nets, getting into his landing craft, going ashore, seeing an enemy position, giving it 2 bursts of Lewis gunfire, and then discovering, oh my goodness, it wasn't a German position, it was the local tram stop for the local light railway. All those little bits of colour, they're there in the book as well. As well with the documents from the archives and the historical narrative. So we've tried to put something of everything in for the specialist reader and for the general reader as well.
Well, it's those little nuggets of history, often things that have a bit of a sense of humor surrounding them, that I think really makes these characters and these times come to life. Moving from the past and present tense to thinking about the past and present generally, we're lucky enough to still have a handful of D-Day veterans still with us today. Richard, you mentioned the opportunity to meet with and speak with them at Normandy very recently. I know you're also the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the British Normandy Memorial. There will soon come a day where we no longer have veterans of D-Day with us. So how do you, speaking to our audience globally, some people can maybe make it to Normandy easily. Some people can stop by the archives and see the documents themselves, but maybe not. And how would you encourage people to continue to learn about D-Day in the most engaging and dynamic way when we don't have the firsthand voices to be able to tell their stories?
No, Catherine, it's a very, very good question. Fortunately, we live in the 21st century where the digital age makes a lot of information available to us. So, and I think John was going to suggest that he'll pass a link around all those on this call. And I would just advise people, or suggest to people, they might like to click onto the Normandy Memorial Trust website, where you can see wonderful pictures of the British Memorial. You can see a number of the veterans talking about their experiences. And going back to something I referred to twice, Churchill was worried that 20,000 would lose their lives on day one. Well, they didn't. But by the end of the Normandy campaign, when the Seine had been crossed and Paris liberated, 22,442 servicemen and women under British command had lost their lives, as so many Canadians and Americans did. So it's really important that we commemorate them, we celebrate their service, we remember their service, but critically, we actually also tell the story for future generations. And at the British Memorial, we've now put in place the Winston Churchill Centre for Education and Learning, and have got a growing programme for bringing school children and young people across to learn the story, to learn the history, to understand just what happened in June, July, August 1944 that restored peace and freedom and decent values to Europe again. And I would commend when that link is passed around, people to look and engage and think whether they want to make a contribution to this. We have a scheme called Guardians of the Memorial, a bit like Friends of, and we've got a lot of guardians, and people can contribute financially to make sure that memorial stays there, but particularly that we can tell the story for future generations. And for the International Churchill Society members, the last phase of the development of that memorial, given we've got 22,442 names on pillars, we are going to put a 1.5 times life-size bronze of Winston Churchill looking down the line of names, saluting. And we actually think that will really focus his role in Overlord, his role in the Second World War, at that very historic and wonderful place. End of commercial.
That's wonderful. And thank you in advance to John for sending that around for everybody to be able to explore further themselves. Let's take a couple of audience questions now. And given that this is the International Churchill Society and Operation Overlord was a truly international collaborative endeavor, one of the enormous players of D-Day who probably gets overlooked more than they should is Canada. And so one of our questions perhaps is coming from a Canadian viewer today. Canada often does get overlooked in the story of D-Day and the aftermath. And so could you please tell us a little bit more about Canada's role in D-Day, and perhaps given the some of the ghosts of history, what might Canada have brought to mind for Winston Churchill as he was considering what was to come with Operation Overlord? Alan, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, I'm very happy to answer this question, not least because I've just come back from a mini tour of Canada and speaking to the various Churchill societies there, Churchill societies in Ottawa, Calgary and Edmonton, where I had the most wonderful hospitality and where there is certainly remains an enormous interest in Churchill and in these events. And hopefully what I was able to do group, what I will be able to do now is to reassure your listeners that, of course, Canada plays an enormous role in all of this. First thing to say, I think, is that, Canada's support for Britain and for the war effort from the beginning is often overlooked. People tend to think of the United States and they think of Lend-Lease. But Canada, right from the beginning, is providing troops, training facilities, merchant marine, navy, air forces, and money, huge amounts of money for the war effort. The Canadian contribution, given the size of the Canadian population, is absolutely enormous to the war effort as a whole. Then, of course, you have the Canadian 2nd Division stationed in the UK, effectively defending the British homeland at a time when, we were incredibly weak and vulnerable. And the Canadian 2nd Division also, of course, probing those French coastal defences and taking huge losses at Dieppe. At Dieppe, an operation where very important lessons were learned about D-Day. You've also got the Canadian contribution to the planning. The Canadians host 2 major conferences at Quebec, and some of the technology that's planned for D-Day is actually developed in Canada, including one particular item that was never actually used in the end, but this was the idea of producing pykrete. And pykrete was a material that was going to be produced from ice and wood pulp. It was the idea of an eccentric inventor called Geoffrey Pike, and his concept was that you could make aircraft carriers from this ice composite. And they actually developed, and I only learnt this last week, they actually developed a prototype pykrete aircraft carrier in a lake in Alberta, and you can still go diving and see the remains of it there. So Canadian contribution in the run-up to D-Day, absolutely huge. And Richard, on the day itself?
Well, on the day itself, as I said right at the start of this conversation, 5 divisions landed on 5 beaches. The Canadian 3rd Division landing on Juno Beach, one of those absolutely critical assault divisions. And I think Canadians should be as proud as anyone of the role that their country played. And as Alan has already said, Operation Jubilee, the 1942 attack on Dieppe, was very, very expensive, very costly in terms of casualties, but there were some really critical lessons learned that were rolled over and contributed significantly to the success of D-Day, not the least of which was the conclusion that taking a port was too difficult, not the least of which was trying to run armoured vehicles up a shingle beach was impossible. So the high cost in blood and treasure by the Canadian 2nd Division in Dieppe in 1942 in Operation Jubilee was itself very instrumental in the planning for Jubilee, planning for Overlord, as indeed was the role of the Canadian 3rd Division landing on Juno on the 6th of June 1944.
Richard, I want to stick with you for a minute and talk about some of the strategic experiences of the Allied armed forces prior to D-Day, moving from Canada to Italy and Operation Husky. One of our viewers has a question about how was Operation Husky, the Allies landing in Sicily 11 months before D-Day, important as a training operation in the success of D-Day, so to speak, or what lessons were drawn from that experience that allowed them to succeed then 11 months later?
Yeah, no, Catherine, that's a really good question, because we said 45 minutes ago that Overlord was the biggest amphibious operation, the biggest multinational tri-service operation that the world had ever seen, is ever likely to see. Well, that didn't just come out like that. It had to be the product of many preliminary operations. I mean, go back before Husky, go back to Operation Torch in North Africa, when the United States military first came into North Africa. That was a learning experience for the United States military. Had quite a bloody nose at Kasserine Pass, but out of these circumstances, you learn lessons. So having successfully kicked the Axis forces out of North Africa, then the logical next step was Operation Husky, moving into Sicily. Now, there some terrible lessons were learned, not the least of which with the airborne troops. Far too many airborne troops lost their lives in the sea because their gliders were launched prematurely, and lessons were learned there. So again, it was a cumulative process of going into Sicily, then going into Italy, fighting their way up Italy, and then you pulled out some of the experienced commanders and experienced units, brought them back to the UK, melded them with the planning that was going on, put the best commanders available in charge, and put all that together. And you then get what we now know with hindsight, as we said several times this evening today, that huge operation that was successful. But it had to grow from small beginnings. It had to grow from trial and error, from experiments, from Operation Jubilee and Dieppe we talked about just now, and all those things. So it's an amalgamation of experience, and it produced a good plan, great leadership, determination from the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on the day, and ultimately led to success.
And I think the only thing I would add to that is tactics as well. What they learn from Operation Torch in North Africa and what they learn in Sicily is how to coordinate these amphibious landings, how you make sure that your infantry are landing on the beach simultaneously with your tanks rather than the tanks coming in behind them and running them over, for example. How you control traffic on a beach and how you get traffic off a beach. And actually, the North African campaign, the Sicilian campaign, these are studied and written up, and then basically inform the manuals for Overlord itself. So the development of the tactics, the development of the equipment, all comes into play here.
And just picking up one of the points that Alan has made in relation to Churchill, tanks arriving before the infantry. Well, where did these tanks come from? These tanks were specially developed tanks that swam ashore. Major General Percy Hobbart was a bit of an oddball in the British Royal Armoured Corps, but he captured the attention, he captured the interest of Winston Churchill, who said we absolutely must go with these unusual notions of General Hobbart. And that's where we get the duplex drive tanks from. The sadness is that on account of the weather, some good decisions were made about when to launch the attacks, when to launch the tanks, and those tanks came ashore and were very useful. Some stuck with the original plan and launched the tanks too far out, and tragically those tanks foundered and the tanks were lost and the crews drowned. But the whole point is, and the point I'm making is that Churchill really espoused this idea. It was novel, it was transformative, and one of the keys to success from a tactical point of view on the day.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about the many plans swirling and the many components and the thinking creatively around various tested and tried methods. Did Churchill and his generals have a contingency plan if D-Day didn't succeed? Was there any backup plan in the works if the D-Day landings were, resulted in Churchill's worst fears?
The answer has to be no. It was a one-shot chance. And of course, chance is the right word. A lot of risk could be planned out, but the one risk that couldn't be planned out was the weather. And there were windows of opportunity. There was a key window around the 5th, 6th, 7th of June, and it wouldn't come again till 2 or 3 weeks later. But of course, coming back to a point that Alan made earlier, if they're delayed by 2 or 3 weeks, the likelihood of being able to keep the operation secret would have diminished significantly. So it was a very bold decision when it was clearly too rough to go on the 5th Group Captain Stagg, the senior Met officer, gave the advice, and Eisenhower took the decision. We will go overnight 5th, 6th, and land on the 6th. And of course, it was successful. And two things I'll say about that. If they had gone 2 weeks later, the worst storm that Normandy had seen for many, many years occurred. The 2 Mulberry harbours were destroyed, and probably the fleet at sea would have been destroyed, and there would have been no second chance. The other point is that the German meteorological officers weren't as good as the Allied ones, and they came to the conclusion they won't attack on the 6th. So Rommel had gone home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The general commanding 7th Division, 7th Army, had called his officers together to Rennes for a study day about their anti-invasion plans, and the general commanding 21st Panzer Division had gone to Paris to spend the night with his mistress. Now, these were decisions that people took, and they were bad decisions. The wrong people were in place at the right time, as it were. But you can plan most risk out, but you can't do much about the weather. Ask us Brits, we study it every day.
Mm-hmm. But you can see why Churchill was worried, and actually you can see that he was right to be worried. That was his job.
Absolutely. Well, we have 2 minutes left. So in the final 2 minutes that we have, first, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you to both Alan and Richard for writing this remarkable book and for spending your time with us. Thank you to John and the International Churchill Society for organizing this event. And just as a final word, as we think about being in the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, we just had last month the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Thinking about the success of D-Day and all that followed between June of 1944 and May of 1945, after the successful D-Day operation, at what point, even though the Germans continued to fight on, did they know that it was game over?
I think that's a very good question. I think there's a multitude of answers. I think a lot of the hierarchy knew that it was game over a long time before May 1945. Let's face it, the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler was pretty widely supported, and there was quite a strong movement to rid ourselves of this madman who's running our country, and let's have some kind of negotiated settlement with the Allies. The Germans would love to have had a negotiated settlement with the Western Allies and joined with us to prevent the Soviet hordes screaming their way towards Berlin. I think for the average soldier, most soldiers just do their duty. I think soldiers who were in SS units probably were more determined than soldiers who were in General Army units. You've got a lot of non-Germans fighting, particularly in some of the static divisions defending the Western Wall. They were probably only too happy to surrender. But I think quite a lot of Germans knew the game was up early, and not early in the war, but certainly by the time the lodgment was made in Normandy. And if they could have found a way out, they'd have taken it.
I think once the Allies had broken out of the bridgehead in Normandy, it was game over.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for connecting so many pieces of the past to our present times. It gives us a lot to think about as we consider leadership, strategy, global affairs, and the history that is with all of us and is part of all of us today. And so I hope everyone who's listening today enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope that you'll join us for future discussions in these Churchill Conversations and other programs hosted by the International Churchill Society. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.